You look at someone who doesn't celebrate and you see emptiness. You see someone who doesn't sing happy birthday, who refuses the toast, who walks away from the party, and you immediately assume that something has broken within that soul. Society has taught us that joy, to be real, needs to be performed. We've been told that silence is a symptom of illness, that loneliness is a failure, and that public celebration is the only acceptable proof of sanity. But Carl Gustav Jung, the man who dedicated his life to listening to the whispers that come from behind the walls of consciousness, looked at that same silence and saw something completely different. Where most see sadness, Jung saw a locked temple. Where the crowd sees the absence of life, he saw a dangerous and sacred fire burning without needing an audience. And this vision changes the very nature of what we understand by being alive. Most people believe that vital energy manifests itself in noise, in shared laughter, in the mutual confirmation that we are all together. But Jung saw something deeply unsettling behind that refusal to participate. He realized that some people don't reject celebration because they are empty, but because they have become too vast to fit into small rituals. They no longer seek witnesses to validate their existence. They don't anchor their identity in dates, in approval, or in the borrowed emotion of the crowd. And that alone should make you hesitate. Jung believed that when someone stops participating in collective joy, something radical and irreversible is happening within their psyche. It's not a system failure, it's a separation. It's a deliberate withdrawal of energy from the outside world to something much deeper and older. Imagine for a moment the courage it takes not to laugh when everyone else is laughing. Think of the invisible strength needed to remain still while the world demands movement. Jung teaches us that what emerges from this internal compression is not depression, although untrained eyes insist on labeling it as such. What emerges is power, a silent, concentrated power, difficult to predict. Therefore, Jung warned that these people should never be misinterpreted or underestimated, because when a person stops celebrating what society celebrates, they cease to be governed by the same psychological rules that control the masses. They leave the known map. Jung understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that human energy doesn't simply disappear. The physics of the soul doesn't allow for a vacuum. If the energy isn't being spent on fireworks for the world to see, it hasn't evaporated. It has simply changed direction. When someone begins to withdraw from celebrations, obligatory gatherings, the deafening noise of collective validation, they aren't losing vitality. They are channeling an entire river inward into regions of the psyche that most people never access, and frankly, would be afraid to access. Jung called this process libidinal, introversion, but don't be fooled by the technical term. What he described was one of the most mysterious and misunderstood movements of human behavior. Most people live with their souls turned outward, like windows open onto a busy street. They desperately need the world to reflect their worth back to them. A birthday party confirms that they matter. A celebrated promotion proves their hierarchical value. A public wedding validates the existence of love. The external ritual becomes the mirror, the only means through which they can see themselves. But Jung asked, what happens when someone breaks the mirror? What happens when a person no longer seeks their reflection in the eyes of others? When they stop feeding their sense of identity through approval and participation in the social theater, something fundamental in the structure of reality changes. The energy that once flowed toward people, events, and applause begins to expand into the depths. It accumulates. It compresses. It transforms. This is not the apathy of depression, which drains life until nothing remains. This is concentration. The person may seem quiet, distant, even cold to those observing from the surface, but beneath that skin, a psychological process of volcanic intensity is unfolding. They are building an inner world so rich, so complex, and so self-sufficient that the outer world begins to seem superficial in comparison. Celebrations seem like poorly rehearsed plays. Social rituals seem like empty shells. Laughter at parties sounds metallic because it lacks the depth and resonance they now experience in absolute solitude. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly, not as a pathology to be cured, but as a phenomenon to be respected. He saw patients who described a growing disinterest in social life, not out of bitterness or resentment against humanity, but out of a silent and terrifying realization that the energy required to participate in the collective illusion was no longer worth the exchange. They weren't rejecting people. They were rejecting the superficiality of connections that didn't penetrate to the core of who they were becoming. And this frightened those around them, because society smells independence and fears it. Jung knew that when a person stops celebrating what society venerates, they no longer obey the laws of men, but begin to respond to the laws of the spirit. And that changes everything. Jung understood, with a clarity bordering on prophecy, that human energy never disappears. It doesn't evaporate into nothingness, just as the water in a river doesn't cease to exist when it encounters a dam. It simply stops flowing forward and begins to rise in level. When someone withdraws from celebrations, when they refuse an invitation to a family gathering or leave the company party early, they are not losing vitality. They are doing something that the physics of the soul demands. They are channeling this violent current inward to regions of the psyche that most people spend their entire lives ignoring. Jung called this movement introversion of libido, and it is essential that you understand that for him, libido was not just sexual desire, but the very energy of life, the fuel of the will, the desire to be. Think about the last time you were at a social event and felt a sudden exhaustion, not physical, but existential. You looked around, saw mouths moving, heard loud laughter, saw toasts being made, but felt that it was all a theatrical performance where nobody really knew the script. For most, this feeling is fleeting. They swallow the discomfort, smile, and keep acting, because the fear of not belonging is greater than the desire for truth. They need the world to reflect their worth back to them like a mirror. A birthday party confirms that they matter. An award confirms their competence. The external ritual becomes the only proof that they are alive. But when someone decides to stop seeking this mirror, when they stop feeding their sense of identity through the approval and participation of others, the energy takes a sharp and dangerous turn. The energy that once flowed outward to sustain conversations about the weather, to maintain politeness at lukewarm dinners, and to feign interest in other people's lives, now begins to expand inward. It accumulates, it compresses, it transforms. This is not depression. Depression is a leak. It drains energy until the tank is dry. What Jung describes is the opposite. It is extreme concentration. The person may seem quiet, distant, sitting in the corner of the room or locked in their office, but beneath this calm surface, an intense process of psychological alchemy is simmering. They are building an inner world so rich, so complex, and so detailed that the outer world begins to look like a cardboard model. Imagine building a cathedral inside your own chest, stone by stone, in absolute silence. That's what happens. And when you're occupied with a work of this magnitude, external distractions cease to be merely irritating. They become unbearable. Celebrations begin to seem performative. Social rituals seem devoid of meaning. Laughter at parties sounds metallic and hollow, because it lacks the depth and resonance that this person now experiences in the solitude of their own abyss. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his patients and noted something fascinating. They described a growing disinterest in social life, not because they hated people, but because of a silent realization that the exchange was no longer worthwhile. They weren't rejecting affection. They were rejecting the superficiality of connection that didn't penetrate to the core of who they were becoming. It's like trying to sell plastic trinkets to someone who just discovered a diamond mine in their backyard. The artificial glitz of the party simply no longer competes with the brilliance of the treasure they found in the dark. But this generates a terrifying side effect for those around them. We feel it when someone withdraws their energy from us. We feel the coldness when attention is removed. And this scares us because at its core, society operates on a system of mutual dependence. We celebrate together to reinforce belonging, to tell each other that we are safe. But when someone withdraws their signature from this invisible contract, when they demonstrate that they can stand on their own without relying on the group, the structure trembles. On the outside, they seem cold. On the inside, they are building universes so dense that shared reality begins to look like a pale, lifeless shadow. And this frightened those around, because a person who no longer needs your validation is a person you can no longer control. Jung realized that society operates on a system of mutual dependence, a silent pact signed the moment we are born, where we tacitly agree to sustain each other's illusions. We celebrate together not only for joy but to reinforce belonging, to create a barrier against the fear of death and oblivion. We toast to shared values and gather in circles to remind ourselves that we are part of a safe tribe. But when someone tears up this contract, when they unilaterally decide to leave this system and no longer need the group to define what is real, they become unpredictable. And in the psychology of the masses, unpredictability is the ultimate threat. They are no longer bound by the same invisible chains that bind most people. Their motivations become opaque, like dark glass through which one cannot see. Their actions no longer follow the expected script that everyone has memorized since childhood. If you praise them, they don't light up. If you criticize them, they don't wither. Jung warned that this withdrawal should not be confused with weakness or lack of social skills. In fact, he believed that it was often quite the opposite. The person who manages to sustain themselves without the crutch of external celebration has gained access to a level of psychological independence that most people never achieve in their entire lives. They have found a source of meaning that does not depend on the public, that does not fluctuate with the approval of others, and that does not require applause to continue existing. Imagine the terrifying freedom of not needing to be loved by the crowd. Jung explored the idea that most social interactions are, in fact, a commercial exchange disguised as affection. I give you attention. You give me status. I go to your party. You validate my importance. But when someone breaks the currency of this exchange, the market collapses. They turned inward and discovered that the self, when fully explored and illuminated by consciousness, is vast enough to occupy an entire life without needing external compliments. But Jung, in his cautious wisdom, knew that this power comes at a devastating cost. The more energy a person draws from the outside world to fuel their inner furnace, the more alien they become to the world they left behind. They begin to see through the mechanisms that govern social behavior with X-ray clarity. They realize how much of human interaction is pure performance, how much of the celebration is merely obligation disguised as joy, how much of the collective enthusiasm is manufactured to meet the expectations of a script that no one wrote, but everyone follows. And here lies the real danger, the point of no return. Once you see the strings that move the puppets, you can't unsee them. Innocence is lost forever. You can't go back to pretending that the birthday cake means something profound, that the New Year's countdown carries genuine magic, or that the wedding reception is anything more than a social choreography of unity and status. Once shattered, an illusion cannot be rebuilt. This is why Jung said that the introversion of libido often leads to a kind of involuntary psychological exile. The person is still physically present, occupying space in the room, breathing the same air, but emotionally and spiritually they have departed for a distant land. They live in a different dimension of experience, a radio frequency that cannot be tuned in through small talk about the weather or standardized social ceremonies. They have become strangers in their own culture, observers of a play in which they no longer wish to participate, and this estrangement only deepens the further they follow the inner path, descending steps into their own soul that lead them away from the surface where everyone else swims. The abyss calls to them, and the silence down there is more seductive than any music playing up here. Still, Jung, in his exploration of the deepest layers of human experience, firmly believed that this withdrawal was not a mistake, but an absolute necessity for certain individuals. Not everyone is designed to live with their energy perpetually directed outward, fueling the social machine. Some souls are called to the inner journey, to the dangerous exploration of the unconscious, to the direct confrontation with the shadow and the painful discovery of the self. For these people, celebration is not only unnecessary, it is a fatal distraction. The noise of congratulations and the clinking of glasses distract them from the work that matters most, the only real task of their lives, the work of becoming whole. And so, they stop celebrating, not because they are sad, not because they are broken, but because they have found something infinitely more compelling in the darkness than the luminous approval of the crowd. They have found the silent power of a self that needs no witnesses to exist. There is a specific moment in psychological development that Jung considered both liberating and terrifying. It happens when a person realizes, in a flash of lucidity, that they no longer need external confirmation to feel real. Their achievements don't need to be announced through megaphones. Their life milestones don't need to be stamped by the presence of others. Their existence doesn't need to be witnessed to have value. This change is so subtle that most people completely ignore it while it's happening, but its effects are profound, seismic, and irreversible. But ask yourself, could you bear to exist fully without anyone knowing? Could you carry the weight of a magnificent victory without telling a single soul? Most would recoil before this abyss of silence, for the untrained ego confuses secrecy with non-existence. Children live entirely through the eyes of others. They are actors on a perpetual stage. They perform to receive applause, seek approval at every turn, and measure their worth by the reactions they provoke in adults. This is natural, biological, and necessary for survival and early development. But the modern tragedy, as Jung observed, is that for most adults, this childlike pattern never completely disappears. They grow old, but continue to live like psychic children, acting as if their lives only matter when someone is watching. They post their victories online as if asking permission to feel good. They throw parties to mark transitions just to ensure the group witnesses their passage through time. They desperately need the collective to endorse their progress, their love, their very presence in the world. However, some people cross an invisible threshold where this need evaporates like mist in the sun. It's not that they become sociopaths or indifferent to the fate of others. It's something much more structural. The center of gravity of their soul shifts. They stop outsourcing their sense of reality to the crowd. They stop presenting life to an imaginary audience. They begin to live from a place so deeply rooted internally, so fixed to the rock of their own being, that external validation becomes not only unnecessary, but irrelevant. And when this happens, they often stop celebrating in the traditional sense, because celebration, as society practices it, is fundamentally an act of asking to be seen. If you feel you're on that threshold, if you're a loner who feels the call to delve deep within yourself but don't know how to navigate those waters, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a simple guide designed for those seeking this autonomy that can help you unlock and organize your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. What happens when the mirror breaks and you discover your face is still there? That's the revelation that changes everything. Jung understood that this change represented a dangerous level of autonomy. A person who doesn't need witnesses is someone who cannot be easily influenced, manipulated, or coerced. They become immune to peer pressure, that gravitational force that keeps most people in line. They don't care about status, because status is a currency that only has value in the market of others' opinions. They are not bothered by exclusion, because solitude is already their home. Social leverage, the main tool by which groups maintain cohesion and control over the individual, loses all power over them. They have become psychologically sovereign. They are no longer subjects of the realm of public opinion, and this makes them both admirable and deeply unsettling to those who still depend on the crowd to know who they are. The sovereignty of the soul is an offense to those who live on their knees begging for approval. When someone reaches this state, solitude ceases to be a punishment and becomes a throne. And there is nothing more threatening to the collective order than a king or queen who reigns in absolute silence, without armies and without a court, governing only the vastness of themselves. How do you control a man who desires nothing you have to offer and fears nothing you can take away? The answer is simple and terrifying. You don't control him. You simply watch, with a mixture of fear and reverence, as he walks where you cannot follow. Society is a complex machine designed to process human desires, offering rewards, recognition, and belonging as currency for obedience. But what happens when this machine encounters someone who is priceless? Jung realized that society simply doesn't know what to do with people who don't need it. The system short-circuits. When someone refuses an invitation to a party, not just out of unavailability, but out of absolute disinterest in what is being offered, the social structure reacts with confusion and fear. These people cannot be bribed with promises of status, because status means nothing to them. They cannot be shamed into conforming, because the opinion of the group has no weight on their self-image. They exist outside the usual mechanisms of social control, operating like ghosts in a world of flesh and blood, and this makes them profoundly unpredictable. This unpredictability was what both intrigued and fascinated Jung. He knew that human behavior is generally governed by a logic of exchange. Do this so that you like me. But a person who has removed the need for witnesses is operating from a completely different psychological operating system, written in a language that the collective cannot read. Their motivations are purely internal. Their values are self-determined, forged in the fire of solitude. Their actions are not calculated to please, impress, or manipulate the perception of others. They follow an inner compass that no one else can see, a magnetic needle pointing to a north that only exists on the map of their own soul. How do you negotiate with someone who already has everything they need within themselves? You don't negotiate, you lose leverage. And this loss of power is what makes the autonomous individual a dangerous figure in the eyes of the group. Jung studied individuals who had achieved this state and discovered that they often possessed an unusual, almost supernatural, mental clarity. Without the constant noise of social anxiety, without the static interference of worrying about what others will think, they could see reality directly and brutally. They noticed patterns that others ignored. They understood the hidden motivations that others tried to conceal. They could predict behaviors with surgical precision because they were not distracted by the emotional performance that everyone else was busy watching or enacting. They saw the bone structure beneath the skin of society, and this clarity, while a superpower, also functioned as a curse that isolated them even further. When you see through the social game with this clarity, it becomes almost impossible to play it sincerely. You begin to realize how much of human conversation is rehearsed, as if everyone were reading an invisible script. You see how people strategically position themselves to gain emotional advantage. You recognize the small manipulations, the performative emotions, the calculated kindness designed to generate a debt of gratitude. And when you see all this, participating in the charade begins to feel like a dirty lie. You feel that by smiling at a tasteless joke or agreeing to an empty ritual, you are betraying your own soul. So you distance yourself even further, and the cycle of isolation deepens, not out of hatred, but out of a physical inability to tolerate falsehood. As the celebration approaches, it completely changes form for these people. The person celebrating alone isn't throwing a sad private party with paper hats and a wilted cake. They are experiencing moments of intense personal significance without needing to translate them into social events. They mark their own milestones in reverent silence. They acknowledge their own growth without issuing a press release. They honor their achievements in ways that leave no trace for others to see, like burying treasure without making a map. And this creates a kind of power that society finds deeply uncomfortable, almost offensive. Jung recognized that autonomy becomes dangerous when it is complete. A partially autonomous person still needs some feedback, some connection, some touch from society to orient themselves. But a fully autonomous person, someone who celebrates entirely within themselves, has broken that last thread of dependence. They have created a closed psychological cycle, a self-sustaining ecosystem where their sense of worth, meaning, and joy is entirely self-generated. No one can give it to them, which means no one can take it away from them. This level of independence is rare, and when it appears, it tends to provoke visceral reactions in others. People feel uncomfortable around someone who doesn't really need their approval. It's like being near a wild animal that doesn't fear humans. It challenges the tacit agreement that we all need each other to feel complete. When someone breaks that agreement and demonstrates that they can thrive in total psychological solitude, it exposes the terrifying fragility of those who cannot live without applause. There comes a point in some people's lives when reality, as we know it, suffers a glaring fracture. Suddenly, birthday candles seem like absurd chunks of wax melting over a cake no one really wants to eat. Wedding vows, heard 1,000 times, sound like rehearsed lines from a bad script. The New Year's countdown, once magical, reveals itself as merely a desperate attempt by humanity to impose order on the chaos of time. What was once sacred suddenly becomes empty, and the person can no longer pretend otherwise. Carl Jung believed that this precise moment was a critical bifurcation in the soul's destiny, a point of no return that could lead to profound growth or complete psychic disintegration. When collective rituals lose their power over an individual, it means that the old structures that organize their social life have crumbled. These rituals exist to connect us to something greater, to mark transitions and create shared meaning. but they only work if there's faith. When that belief evaporates, the ritual becomes a dead shell, a soulless movement. For most people, this never happens. They participate in the theater until the end, protected by the comforting illusion of the group. But for those who see through the curtain, the veil is lifted. They realize that the meaning was never in the celebration itself, but in the collective agreement to believe in it. And once you see that, innocence dies. You can't go back to sleep after you've woken up. Jung understood that this loss of faith in rituals often followed a silent crisis, perhaps a profound betrayal, perhaps an irreparable loss, or perhaps simply the accumulation of years observing human hypocrisy. Whatever the trigger, the result is the same. The person finds themselves alone in a universe without maps. And here lies the real danger that Jung feared. The human psyche does not tolerate a vacuum. If the laws of society no longer govern its behavior, what laws will? When someone is freed from the obligation to celebrate what society celebrates, they face an intoxicating, yet toxic, freedom. If there is no one to judge, if the approval of the group no longer matters, what prevents the soul from getting lost in the darkness? Without the vigilance of the group, a human being can rise to the status of a saint or descend to that of a demon. Jung warned that total autonomy is a trial by fire for character. The person who celebrates alone must build their own ethical cathedral, brick by brick, without the help of external architects. They need to decide for themselves what is good and what is evil, what is sacred and what is profane. And this process of legislating one's own soul, without the barriers of collective wisdom, can go terribly wrong. Jung saw this happen repeatedly. Individuals who freed themselves from social structures ended up convincing themselves that they had found something superior, when in reality, they were only running away. They looked down on those who still celebrated birthdays and participated in common rituals, seeing themselves as awakened among the sleeping. But Jung knew that this feeling of superiority was often just a disguise for spiritual arrogance. The person who isolates themselves risks letting their shadow, the dark and repressed part of the psyche, grow uncontrollably. Without friction with others, without anyone to say, "You're wrong," the shadow can take the throne. They may begin to believe they are gods in their own private universe, justifying cruelty or indifference as if it were elevated wisdom. They think they have transcended human morality, but in reality, they have only regressed to a state of primitive selfishness. Refusal to participate is not in itself freedom. It may simply be avoidance. Jung identified that the most troubling individuals were those who combined this social autonomy with a total lack of self-awareness. They didn't celebrate because they believed they had overcome the human need for connection, but deep down, they were merely protecting old wounds that refused to heal. They weren't independent, they were defensive, and because they didn't understand this about themselves, they became dangerous. The line between the visionary genius who sees the truth and the madman who has lost touch with reality is much thinner than we would like to admit. Those who abandon the rituals of men need the brutal courage to confront the monsters that live in the labyrinth of their own minds, because inside, in the darkness, there is no one to hear their cries for help. When life's energy is dammed up within the chest, it doesn't sleep, it vibrates. Jung compared the human psyche to an untamed force of nature. If left to flow freely into the world, it spreads out, becomes shallow and harmless. But if it is contained, if it is compressed by voluntary isolation and the refusal to seek validation, it gains a hydraulic pressure capable of moving mountains. The person who draws their energy from social rituals is not emptying themselves. They are becoming denser. They transform into a nuclear reactor of meaning. In this pressurized silence, thoughts and creations emerge that would never survive the light of day or the noise of collective approval. The psyche, under this extreme pressure, is forced to reorganize itself, crystallizing into forms of frightening originality. But Jung viewed this process with a mixture of reverence and terror, for he knew that not every spirit possesses the necessary inner architecture to withstand such gravity without collapsing. The compressed self becomes a final gamble. It can be the cradle of a new consciousness or the tomb of sanity. The most disturbing truth Jung left us is this: the person who celebrates alone in absolute silence may be finishing building a divine cathedral within themselves, a temple of wisdom that will serve as a shelter for their soul, Or they may simply be counting the seconds until a detonation that will destroy everything around them. And often, until the very end, they themselves don't know which of the two fates awaits them. The invitation you receive is not to abandon the world or reject the people you love, but to reclaim sovereignty over your own joy. You don't need to become a hermit to access this power, but you desperately need to learn to exist without the drug of approval. Try, just once, to achieve something great and not tell anyone. Keep the secret. Feel the energy burning inside you instead of letting it leak out in exchange for empty likes or congratulations. Learn to celebrate in the dark. Build an inner altar where you are the only priest and the only witness. When you learn to nourish yourself from your own source, you become unshakable. The world may turn its back on you, the applause may cease, the lights may go out, and yet you will remain standing, whole, illuminated by a fire that was not lit by human hands. That is true individuation. That is the power that frightens society, because it is the only power it cannot give you, and consequently, cannot take away from you. Real freedom begins the moment you realize that the best party of your life is the one that happens in silence, within your own heart, where the only presence needed is your own. Perhaps the greatest celebration of all is the one where the only guest is your own soul. If these words resonated deep within you, if you felt the call to this kind of freedom, don't leave without leaving your mark. Like this video so that this message reaches others who walk alone. Subscribe to the channel to continue this journey into the depths of the psyche. And, if you have the courage, leave a comment below, even if it's just a dot or a symbol, as a discreet sign that you too are building your cathedral in silence. We see you.